Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Quad S meeting. Our first speaker of the day is Ashley Haymond. Ashley will be speaking about hall monitors and ambassadors to I can't speak this morning. Ecstasy. How dungeon monitors view their role in semi-public BDSM venues. Ashley, take it away.
So, welcome. Thank you. Happy Thursday, happy heat wave, depending on where you are in the country. Start my slideshow. Okay, so today we're going to talk about dungeon monitors and how they view their role in semi-public BDSM venues. And that's the purpose of this study. It came out of my dissertation research where I looked at bystander intervention and also how they view their role. So this is just one of my research questions. So I realized that this is a SIG, but given that there's almost 100 people here, not everybody's probably going to have the same level of understanding. So BDSM is an acronym. You can read the terms on the screen, but basically, in a nutshell, it's the exchange of power, relinquishing power, assuming power, and also the exchange of sensation. Can be mild or sensual, all the way to intense and painful in a negotiated and consensual environment, and sometimes in an erotic environment as well. Engaging in BDSM behaviors is sometimes called play or playing, and the scene is a pre-negotiated, time-limited period in which people play. So some people play in semi-public venues. Those are called dungeons many times. And people don't necessarily play in dungeons all the time. They may just go socialize. And I don't know if anybody's seen the Netflix show, How to Build a Sex Room. If you haven't, it's kind of a trip. But some of the sex rooms that she builds for couples have furniture in them. Dungeons will also have this type of furniture for people who don't want that in their home or just don't have a fairy godmother who will bestow that upon them. You should check that show out. It's kind of funny. So dungeon monitors are individuals who are trained to watch over activities in dungeons, looking for safety violations, safety, consent, that sort of thing. They do pre-scene guidance where they will guide people to maybe a more appropriate location in the venue or ask them to do something different if they think it's going to violate the rules. They may notice events, determine if those events are worthy of an intervention, and then intervene in scenes as necessary. A little bit about the literature. So BDSM practitioners and many non-normative sexuality communities face stigma. And community plays a role, a big role for a lot of people, and one role that it plays is stigma mitigation. So the professed norms of consent and safety and the use of DMs help the community strive for what Weinberg called social decriminalization. And that's in saying to the outside world, you don't need to police us, we police ourselves. Dungeon monitors have been mentioned a handful of times in the academic literature, but they've never been studied in a group in and of themselves. And also other collective sex environments have monitors that perform somewhat similar functions. For instance, they may enforce rules on condom use or prohibitions on drug use. They may also enforce spatial segregation, whereas less intimate activities can take place in the front of the club. Social activities need to be in a certain portion, more intimate activities need to be in the back, that sort of thing. So I reached out to dungeon monitors by contacting BDSM venues and organizations. Among inclusion criteria, they had to have been a DM within the past 3 years and worked 5 shifts. I used a screener survey, 153 dungeon monitors responded, and I used a stratified sampling strategy. I interviewed 22 dungeon monitors who ranged in age from 23 to 77. Around 77% of those people were cisgender. Around 60% identified as bisexual, pansexual, or queer. About 60% of the participants were white. All of them had some sort of college experience, and nearly all of them attended some sort of training to be a dungeon monitor and shadowed an experienced dungeon monitor before they started doing their own dungeon monitor shifts. And then the dungeon monitors came from 13 states with a good geographic spread. I conducted 60 to 90 minute semi-structured interviews, and then I conducted thematic analysis on those interviews. Two very broad themes came from the interviews. One is facilitating experiences, and the second one is responsibility to community. So this is where you get your hall monitors and your ambassadors texts. So dungeon monitors wanted to create a supportive environment and also assure safety. According to one, it's very meaningful to me to be part of creating a space that allows people to explore themselves. I get choked up over it sometimes. It's such a profound responsibility to me. Dungeon monitors also wanted to play a role in creating spaces for things that are considered extreme, even within the BDSM community. I want to keep dungeons safe for people to go to really vulnerable places emotionally. Sometimes it takes really rough treatment, either physically or emotionally, to do that. If someone's uncomfortable watching that, then they should move somewhere else. Let us not turn this into Disneyland. And these are your hall monitors, assuring safety. This is where you get to the bystander intervention piece, the pre-scene guidance, and also attending to the concerns of onlookers. According to this dungeon monitor, all the people who come, a DM can enter your scene at any time, we can stop it. We have the right to ask questions, inspect your equipment, and they are expected to stop and listen and do whatever we have asked. Safety is important, and they take that role seriously. The second major theme is responsibility to community, and I'll work through each of these themes in the following slides. So responsibility to the venue, this is where you get to the social decriminalization piece. I want to make sure that nothing happens in that dungeon which creates a probable cause for some outside forces to come in and they wrongfully shut us down. And then there's teamwork. Dungeon monitors work together. We divvy up the work based on specialty. It's really relying on other people's experiences because everyone has different walks of life and will have better strengths in particular areas of the dungeon than others. Community leadership. You're kind of under a spotlight all the time. That has made me a good bit more safety conscious. Like basically, it's made me keep my own house in order. But there are pros and cons to this visibility, this leadership is being looked up to. So the biggest risks really come from people thinking that I know what's up. The reality is like, I got 3 hours of training. I'm not really an authority on anything. I think that that causes people to like overestimate how safe they really are. And then dungeon monitors have an ethic of continuous improvement. And this can take the form of introspection and also continuing education, devoting time to taking additional training, taking classes, to learning more about different skills and techniques. So according to this dungeon monitor, a lot of that development as the dungeon monitor involves soul searching. Like, why am I questioning this? Is it because of my own discomfort? Then you can toss it out the window. And then when dungeon monitors travel, they go to other dungeons. Just like patrons sometimes are frustrated by dungeon monitors get frustrated by other dungeon monitors. I've been in an experience before where I've been finger wagged at, even though it was perfectly consensual, just because it was a fetish or type of play that the DM was unfamiliar with. That has made me a lot more watchful of issues in our dungeons. So they channel that frustration into improving their own monitoring skills. So discussion, for dungeon monitors, it's an avocation. They devote time, intellectual resources, money. You know, it's something more of a calling for some dungeon monitors than simply working a snack bar is important, setup and cleanup is important, but this for there's emotional investment. Dungeon monitors also mentioned emotional labor and supporting concerned onlookers, and sometimes onlookers taking them away from the important work of monitoring. With regard to enhanced educational opportunities, and also the dungeon monitor talked about divvying things up, especially rope play, which can be very skill intensive, can look scary to a person who's not, doesn't know what they're looking at. Some dungeon monitors didn't want to monitor that or were intervening when it wasn't necessarily appropriate just because they didn't understand what they were looking at. Also, for the clinician side, awareness that dungeons may provide a potentially safer environment to engage in BDSM, especially having your first encounter with somebody that you haven't met. Having it in public, you lose some privacy, but you also gain a cadre of people watching out. Limitations. So these dungeon monitors may have answered these questions in ways that make themselves and the community look good. Also, are the dungeon monitors who took part in my survey representative of other dungeon monitors, or are they somehow different? Also, retrospective recall. So this required memory, and I did these interviews during COVID, so some people hadn't been in a dungeon for a year. So that's also another limitation of this study. So thank you for your time. If you want to reach out, you can find me on Twitter. You can also email me through my website. And I will be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so very much. Thank you, Ashley. That was wonderful. Thank you for everything you presented. Does anyone have any questions for Ashley at this time? And then you can also, if you're pondering, you can ask questions later on after the other presentations as well. So there's a question in the chat. Any data on how DMs were trained?
So there's not a consistent training across the country. Some trainings are an hour long, some trainings are a weekend long. It really just depends on the club management, how involved they want the DMs to be. So yeah, it's all over the board, the amount of training. One thing the dungeon monitors did mention is that if they had some kind of role play in their training, it was very helpful. So having two people acting out a scene and perhaps doing something quote unquote wrong, and then when do you intervene, how do you intervene, that kind of training for people who had the role play, they thought it was very important. People who didn't have the role play said, I wish I had that role play.
Thank you. And I think I remember seeing in your dissertation that you have links to maybe 3 different DM training programs around the country, if I remember from your dissertation. Yeah,
I do cite some training programs, but I haven't actually looked at the materials. But I did cite that these organizations are out there.
So there's another question in the chat. Did you find any differences by race as to how their authority was respected by dungeon attendees?
You know what, even despite asking that question, no. The only thing about race that came up, and I specifically asked about this, were white participants who were, again, doing that introspection of why am I intervening in this? Am I intervening because I'm somehow uncomfortable with the race of these people, sort of interrogating their motives. But other than that, no, I think dungeon monitors are pretty much well respected, even if sometimes they're not liked. I think they are respected.
Thank you. Another question. You have some wonderful questions for you here. So the next question, are there resources available to help guide DM practices?
There are, and as Frederick mentioned, different organizations around the country that do training. So I would suggest a web search of those. I know Black Rose does some training in DC. There's a Dungeon Monitor Academy in California. I don't know if you know Shay Tiziano. I'm not saying her last name right. They do a very large and thorough Dungeon Monitor training. So I haven't compiled anything. You kind of have to research it on your own, but there's definitely a lot of stuff out there.
And Shay Tiziano also published a book, I believe this year, maybe late last year, about sex education and kink. And so there's some really great information in that book that Shay just published. Let's see, got another question or two. Are most DMs tops? Do you know how they identify in terms of power exchange?
Yes. Okay, hold on. I don't know how much time we have. I took that slide out, but let me find it. It's very interesting. Zoom, zoom, zoom. Don't get dizzy. This is my whole presentation. Okay.
While you're looking at that, we will do one more question after this, and then we're going to go on to ODM.
Okay, so I'm not going to go into the full screen mode, but so around half identified as dominant initiators. So for people who are kind of unfamiliar, those are the people who, you know, provide the sensation or embody the powerful role. About a third were switches, and then about 18% were on the other side. So two identified as slaves, the bottom, and a submissive. Those are the people who receive the sensation or kind of relinquish power. So there's a ton of switches in there. So it's like, you know, do they lean one way or do they lead the other? So definitely not all tops, if that might be what the person was getting at. So good question.
And so we're going to do one more question, and then we're going to go on to the next presentation. But I want to remind you, if you're still pondering, if you have more questions for Ashley, you're welcome to ask those questions after the other presentations, and we can have further conversation then. So the last question for Ashley at this time is, did any DMs mention that they asked people to inform them in advance before play begins or during orientation about any less well-known, more complex play or those that involve weapons such as knives, etc.?
Yes, exactly. And many of them said that's like the policy of the venue to let people know ahead of time. And actually one Dungeon Monitor, a couple were doing like a consensual non-consent scene. So that's where people kind of play around with the idea of saying, no, get away from me, stop, but they want it to be ignored. And they saw this going on and they they stopped it. But that's because they didn't know that it was, I think it was a miscommunication. They told one person, but they didn't communicate it to all the others. So yes, they want to be told, that sort of thing.
Cool. Thank you so much. So I do apologize. There are two more questions currently in the chat, but we're going to have to hold off on those so that we don't cascade into not having enough time for Vanessa, Lexi, and Courtney at the end. And